Lucas Sinclair, a respected federal prosecutor, finds his world turned upside down when he's arrested for a crime he didn't commit, based on nothing more than a vague description. What begins as a case of mistaken identity quickly unravels into something far more sinister. The arrest wasn't a mistake. It was a move in a dangerous game, orchestrated by powerful forces determined to bury the truth. Lucas soon discovers that his arrest is linked to a web of corruption reaching deep into law enforcement, fueled by hidden agendas and dangerous alliances. With every step, he's confronted by betrayal, manipulation, and enemies who will stop at nothing to silence him. But Lucas isn't just fighting to clear his name. He's fighting for a system that's crumbling under the weight of greed and deception. As he peels back the layers of this conspiracy, one question lingers. What happens when the very people sworn to uphold the law break it in secret? The afternoon sun blazed over the courthouse parking lot as Officer Ryan Garrett adjusted his radio. His voice was sharp as he spoke into the device. "I've got him. Suspect matches the description perfectly." Ryan's footsteps echoed across the pavement as he moved toward the figure in question. A tall black man wearing a tailored charcoal suit and holding a leather briefcase. The man's calm demeanor only fueled Ryan's determination. "Hands where I can see them," Ryan ordered, though the man was making no sudden moves. The man regarded him steadily, eyes unwavering. "You're making a mistake," he said evenly. His voice was calm but firm, carrying a quiet confidence that unsettled Ryan. Ryan's partner, Officer Scott Mayer, shifted uncomfortably nearby. His gaze flitted between Ryan and the man. "Ryan, you sure about this?" Scott asked, his voice low but uncertain. Ryan shot his partner a glare. "Descriptions don't lie. Let the court sort it out." The official description was straightforward. Tall black male, early 40s, wearing a dark suit. It matched perfectly. That was all Ryan needed. Yet something about the man's demeanor gnawed at him. He wasn't defensive or argumentative. He didn't plead or run. Instead, he moved with the composure of someone who knew exactly how the system worked, and perhaps how often it failed. The sound of bustling footsteps from courtgoers surrounded them as they ascended the courthouse steps. Ryan kept a firm grip on the man's arm, as though expecting him to bolt at any moment. The man's gaze flickered toward the courthouse entrance as they approached. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk crossed his lips. "You're going to regret this," he said softly, the words hanging in the air like a quiet challenge. Ryan's jaw tightened. "We'll see about that," he muttered. Inside, the courthouse was a mosaic of polished floors and murmured conversations. Sunlight streamed in through high windows, illuminating rows of benches where spectators gathered for the day's hearings. Conversations hushed as Ryan led the man toward the defense table. "Another arrest?" someone whispered. "He's relentless." Officer Mayer lingered behind, observing the scene unfold with an uneasy expression. He had seen Ryan make dozens of arrests before, but something about this one felt different. The man's polished shoes clicked against the marble floor as he took his place before the judge's bench, his back straight, his expression unreadable. He still carried the same briefcase, its leather surface untouched by even a single scuff. Judge Whitaker, an older man with a tired but observant gaze, shuffled through his papers before addressing the court. "Officer Garrett, please present your case." Ryan stepped forward, his shoulders squared. "Your Honor, this man matches the description provided by several witnesses in a string of downtown thefts last week. Tall black male, early 40s, wearing a dark suit. The description fits him exactly." His words brimmed with certainty, though they hung heavy in the air. Judge Whitaker raised an eyebrow. "I see." He turned his attention to the accused. "Sir, would you please state your name for the record?" The man set his briefcase down with a deliberate motion and adjusted his tie before answering. His tone was measured and composed. "My name is Lucas Sinclair. I'm a federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice." The room fell silent. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few people exchanged wide-eyed glances as whispers erupted in the gallery. Did he say federal prosecutor? Ryan's confident smirk faltered, but only for a second. He quickly recovered. "Your Honor, I don't see how his profession is relevant to the charges against him." Lucas turned slowly to face Ryan, his eyes as sharp as glass. "It's relevant because it highlights the recklessness of your actions, Officer Garrett. You detained me without cause, based solely on a vague description and nothing more." The quiet in the courtroom thickened. The air itself seemed to grow heavier. Judge Whitaker tapped his gavel lightly, quieting the growing murmurs. "Let's maintain order." Lucas's voice didn't rise, but it carried a weight that filled the room. "You stopped me without any evidence, no probable cause, just an assumption." Ryan's face hardened as he took a step closer to the witness stand. "The description came from multiple witnesses," he shot back. "It wasn't just an assumption, it was a lead." Lucas tilted his head, as if studying Ryan under a microscope. "A lead? Or a stereotype?" His words were calm, almost surgical in their precision. "Did you ask for details? Or did you stop the first black man you saw in a suit?" A ripple of gasps echoed through the room. Judge Whitaker's brow furrowed. Mayer shifted uncomfortably in the back, running a hand through his hair. Ryan's face flushed as he stammered. "That's not fair." Lucas's eyes narrowed. "Fair?" His voice sharpened like a blade. "Do you know how many times men who look like me are stopped, questioned, or detained simply because they fit the description? I've spent my career upholding the law, Officer Garrett. What you did today is the exact opposite of that." Judge Whitaker raised a hand. "Gentlemen, that's enough," he said firmly. But there was a glimmer of curiosity in his eyes as he studied Lucas. Lucas inclined his head respectfully, but the steel in his gaze remained. The judge exhaled slowly, his gavel resting lightly in his hand. "Mr. Sinclair, I'll allow you to elaborate briefly." Lucas nodded and took a step forward. The room's attention locked onto him as though he had commanded it by sheer force of will. "This incident isn't just a mistake," Lucas began. "It's a window into the systemic issues that plague our legal system. When assumptions replace evidence, when bias overrides judgment, innocent people suffer." The courtroom was motionless, the silence almost reverent. Even those who had initially dismissed the case as routine found themselves sitting on the edge of their seats. Ryan clenched his fists at his sides. His earlier bravado had diminished into a defensive posture. He had expected another routine arrest, a case that would slide through the system without scrutiny. Instead, he stood before a man who didn't just know the law, he embodied it. Lucas's voice softened, but carried the same resolute strength. "Justice isn't about convenience, Officer Garrett. It's about accountability, and that starts today." Mayer watched as Ryan's confidence finally crumbled. He felt the weight of Lucas's words pressing down on him like a tide that couldn't be stopped. Judge Whitaker's gaze swept between the two men. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something rare in his courtroom, a reckoning. The judge cleared his throat, signaling the next stage of proceedings. But something in the room had shifted. This wasn't just about a wrongful arrest anymore. It was about a system long overdue for change. The courtroom was as silent as a held breath. The revelation of Lucas Sinclair's identity hung over everyone like a thundercloud ready to break. No one moved. The judge's pen hovered above his notepad. Forgotten. Officer Ryan Garrett's pulse pounded in his ears. His grip on the papers in his hand tightened until the edges crinkled. He forced a smirk to return to his face, though it felt hollow. "Your Honor," Ryan began, his voice louder than necessary to mask the quiver beneath. "His position doesn't change the facts of the case." Judge Whitaker arched an eyebrow, his sharp gaze fixed on the officer. "And what facts would those be, Officer Garrett?" Ryan cleared his throat and stepped forward as though to reclaim control of the room. Multiple witnesses described a tall black male, early 40s, wearing a dark suit. Mr. Sinclair matches that description perfectly. He was near the location of the thefts just before they were reported. This arrest was made in good faith. The judge turned toward Lucas, his fingers steepled in front of him. Mr. Sinclair, do you have anything to say in response? Lucas nodded, his expression unreadable. Yes, Your Honor, if I may? The judge gestured for him to proceed. Lucas took a single step forward, his polished shoes clicking softly on the floor. His voice was measured, deliberate. I'm not standing here today because I was caught committing a crime. I'm standing here because I fit a vague, insufficient description. Tall black male, early 40s, wearing a dark suit. He paused, letting the words settle. That could describe hundreds of men in this city. A murmur spread through the gallery like a low tide creeping in. Some nodded, their eyes dark with understanding. Others whispered among themselves, uncertain how to process what was unfolding before them. Lucas turned back to Ryan, his eyes locking onto the officers. Did you ask for any distinguishing features? Scars? Tattoos? Accents? Or anything else that could narrow down your suspect? Ryan hesitated. The witnesses… Lucas cut him off, his voice still calm but now sharp enough to cut through steel. Did the witnesses describe anything other than what I'm wearing and the color of my skin? Ryan's silence was louder than any answer he could have given. Lucas took another step, addressing the room now. That's the problem. Too often vague descriptions become convenient shortcuts, and those shortcuts lead to wrongful arrests, broken lives, and shattered trust. He turned back to Judge Whitaker. Your Honor, I'm a federal prosecutor. I've dedicated my career to upholding the law, and yet here I am dragged into this courtroom because someone saw my suit and skin before they saw me. The judge tapped his pen against his desk in a slow rhythm, deep in thought. Just then, the courtroom door creaked open, and a uniformed courier stepped in, holding an envelope. Excuse me, Your Honor, the bailiff said, taking the envelope and walking it to Lucas. This was delivered with urgency for Mr. Sinclair. Lucas frowned as he accepted the envelope and opened it. His eyes scanned the note, and for a brief second, his composed mask cracked barely, but enough for anyone paying close attention to notice. Ryan watched him warily, his instincts kicking in. What's that? He asked, taking a step closer. Lucas folded the note and slipped it into his briefcase, locking the latch with a sharp click. Nothing that concerns you, he replied. But Judge Whitaker had seen it too. Mr. Sinclair, is there something you wish to bring to the court's attention? Lucas's expression hardened as he shook his head. No, Your Honor, just a reminder that some battles don't end in court. Ryan's stomach twisted. He wasn't sure if Lucas was threatening him or something else entirely. He glanced at his partner Scott, who gave him a questioning look. Everything okay? Scott mouthed. Ryan ignored him and turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to bring forward a witness to corroborate the details of the arrest. Judge Whitaker motioned for the bailiff to call the witness. A middle-aged man in a rumpled polo and khakis entered the room, his steps hesitant but determined. State your name for the record, the judge instructed. Neil Robertson, the man replied, voice shaking slightly as he took the stand. Ryan stepped forward. Mr. Robertson, can you confirm that you saw this man? He pointed to Lucas, near the scene of the crime last Friday. Neil hesitated, glancing nervously between Lucas and Ryan. Yes. Well, I saw someone who looked like him. Lucas folded his arms and leaned forward slightly. Define looked like me, Mr. Robertson. Neil swallowed hard. Well, he had a briefcase like yours, and he was tall, wearing a suit. Lucas raised an eyebrow. Anything more specific? Did he have a scar, glasses, a noticeable way of walking? Neil's face reddened. No, just, he looked like you. Lucas turned to Judge Whitaker. Your Honor, there it is. The only thing tying me to this crime is that I exist, that I dared to walk to lunch wearing a suit while black. A collective hush fell over the room. Even Ryan felt the heat of the statement settle like a weight on his chest. The judge leaned forward. Officer Garrett, is there anything else you'd like to present at this time? Ryan hesitated, sensing his control over the situation slipping. Your Honor, we're still gathering more information. Lucas stepped forward again, his voice steady. Justice delayed is justice denied, Officer Garrett. He turned to the gallery, his words now for everyone. How many lives are disrupted or destroyed because someone fit the description? How many young men are stopped, questioned, or detained, not because they're guilty, but because they exist in someone else's suspicion? The judge raised his hand. Enough, Mr. Sinclair. We're here to establish facts, not narratives. But his gaze remained thoughtful, almost troubled. Lucas inclined his head. Understood, Your Honor. Judge Whitaker sighed, tapping his fingers on the bench. Let's proceed carefully from here. This case is no longer about just one arrest. It's about what happens when assumptions override evidence. Ryan exchanged a glance with Scott. It's not over, Ryan muttered. But deep down, doubt was already seeping in, like water through a crack in the dam. Lucas watched the officers with the same calm that had unnerved Ryan from the start. He wasn't just defending himself, he was building something bigger. And it was clear to everyone that this was only the beginning. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as the judge signaled for a short recess. People shuffled out of their seats, some whispering about what they'd just witnessed. Others stayed behind, too engrossed in the unfolding drama to leave. Lucas Sinclair remained at the defense table, calm but visibly deep in thought. Ryan Garrett, however, wasn't calm at all. He headed toward his partner, Scott Mayer, who stood near the courtroom's rear. Something's not right, Ryan muttered, running a hand over his face. That envelope, the way Sinclair reacted, it's like he knows something we don't. Scott shrugged uneasily. He's a prosecutor, Ryan. He probably knows a lot of things we don't, but maybe we're in over our heads on this one. Ryan shot him a hard look. We're not in over anything. We're following the leads we were given. I'm not backing down just because he's got a fancy title. Scott hesitated before speaking, lowering his voice. I get it, but we didn't dig deeper. What if we're wrong? Ryan's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, Lucas stood and approached them, his eyes sharp. Officer Garrett, I suggest you spend the recess thinking about your next steps. You're trying to fight a case you were never prepared for. Ryan's lips curled into a strained smile. Is that a threat? Lucas tilted his head. No, it's a warning. He walked past them without another word, his leather briefcase swinging by his side. As Lucas stepped into the hallway, the noise of reporters and onlookers hit him like a wave. Microphones were thrust in his face as cameras clicked furiously. Mr. Sinclair, is it true you're claiming misconduct by the police? One reporter shouted. Lucas raised a hand but kept his expression neutral. The truth is being revealed in that courtroom. I'll speak when the time is right. He pushed through the crowd and headed toward a quieter corner near a window overlooking the street. The sun gleamed off car rooftops below, but Lucas barely noticed. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out the note he'd received earlier. They know about the investigation. Be careful. His fingers tightened around the paper. He had known that pursuing the truth in his latest federal case would make him enemies. But this? This was something else. The arrest wasn't random, it was orchestrated. He took a slow breath and let the note slip back into his briefcase. He needed more time, more leverage, but time was running out. Back inside the courtroom, the gallery began to fill up again as the recess ended. Lucas returned to the defense table with the same air of calm authority. Ryan entered a few moments later, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. Judge Whitaker called the court back to order. Let's resume, he said, his gavel tapping once. "Mr. Sinclair, you may continue your statement." Lucas stood, his voice clear and strong. "Your Honor, I'd like to present a critical point before this case goes any further. While Officer Garrett insists that his actions were justified, I must remind the court that assumptions in policing are dangerous, especially when combined with vague descriptions. But there's more." He glanced toward the gallery before continuing. "This arrest didn't happen in isolation. It happened because there's a larger issue at play." The judge's eyebrows knit together. "What issue are you referring to, Mr. Sinclair?" Lucas straightened his tie and addressed the court. "I've been pursuing a federal investigation into a coordinated fraud scheme involving missing government funds. Certain individuals with significant influence don't want that investigation to move forward." He turned toward Ryan. "This arrest wasn't just reckless, it was convenient." A stunned silence gripped the room. Ryan's eyes narrowed. "What the hell are you talking about?" Lucas ignored the outburst. "Let's ask this. Why would a prosecutor be framed for petty theft just days after uncovering evidence in a multi-million-dollar case?" Judge Whitaker leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Sinclair. Do you have proof that this arrest is connected to your investigation?" Lucas didn't blink. "Not yet, but there's more at stake here than my innocence." The judge's gavel struck the bench. "Let's stay focused on the matter at hand. Officer Garrett, do you have any further evidence or testimony to support your claim?" Ryan hesitated, then nodded toward the back of the room. "Your Honor, I'd like to call another witness." The bailiff opened the door, and a woman in a crisp blouse and blazer stepped in. Her heels clicked purposefully as she approached the stand. "Please state your name for the record," the judge instructed. "Claire Morton," she replied. Lucas's eyes narrowed. He recognized her, an investigator who had worked closely with the DOJ, but who'd resigned under mysterious circumstances. Ryan addressed her confidently. "Ms. Morton, can you confirm that you were present near the scene of the thefts last Friday?" Claire folded her hands. "Yes, I was." "And did you see Mr. Sinclair in the area?" Ryan pressed. Claire hesitated, glancing at Lucas before answering. "I saw someone who looked like him." Lucas leaned forward. "Ms. Morton, are you absolutely sure it was me?" Claire's eyes flickered with something Lucas couldn't quite read. Guilt, maybe. "I'm not entirely sure," she admitted. A ripple of murmurs ran through the courtroom. Lucas seized the moment. "Your Honor, this is exactly my point. How many more vague testimonies are we going to allow before we admit that there's no real evidence tying me to any crime?" He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "I'm not fighting for just myself today. I'm fighting for anyone who's ever been targeted because they fit a description instead of a truth." The gallery erupted into whispers again, and Judge Whitaker had to strike his gavel twice. "Order!" the judge barked, silencing the room. Lucas sat down slowly, but his words still seemed to hang in the air. Meanwhile, Ryan exchanged a glance with Claire, who looked away. A strange chill ran down his spine. Had Claire been brought in to help, or was she another pawn in a game bigger than them all? As the hearing continued, Lucas's mind was elsewhere, racing ahead. If someone in the courtroom was working to derail him, he needed to uncover who and fast. The stakes were higher than anyone realized. The air in the courtroom felt heavier now, as though every breath carried the weight of suspicion. Claire Morton's hesitant testimony had shifted the balance of the case, but not in the way Ryan Garrett had hoped. Instead of sealing Lucas Sinclair's fate, her uncertainty cracked the foundation of the accusation. Lucas remained seated, watching Claire closely as she stepped down from the witness stand, her face pale. He didn't need to ask why she'd wavered. He knew how pressure could make people fold. What he didn't know was who had pressured her. Judge Whitaker straightened in his chair, adjusting his glasses. "Officer Garrett, do you have any additional witnesses or evidence to present?" Ryan hesitated, caught between stubbornness and doubt. His gut told him to stay the course, but something about Claire's discomfort gnawed at him. She wasn't supposed to falter. Her confidence was what he had counted on. No, Your Honor. Not at this time, Ryan admitted through gritted teeth. Lucas stood, buttoning his suit jacket with a calm, deliberate motion. Your Honor, may I ask a question? The judge nodded. Proceed. Lucas turned to Ryan, his expression neutral. Officer Garrett, why did you choose Claire Morton as a witness? Ryan folded his arms. She was there. She saw someone matching your description. Someone, Lucas repeated. He paced slowly in front of the jury box, his tone thoughtful. Ms. Morton's testimony didn't confirm it was me. She only said she saw someone who looked like me. But how did she even know to testify here today? Did you contact her directly? Ryan tensed. Yes, of course I did. Lucas stopped pacing and faced the officer. Why her? Out of all the witnesses listed in the initial report, why pick someone whose connection to this case seems fragile at best? The room was silent again. Lucas could feel the spectators holding their breath. Ryan's eyes darted to Claire, who was seated in the gallery, avoiding his gaze. Something wasn't adding up, and Lucas knew it. Officer Garrett, Lucas pressed, his voice softening, but losing none of its weight. Did someone suggest Claire Morton to you? Did someone tell you to put her on the stand today? The judge leaned forward, suddenly more interested. Officer Garrett, answer the question. Ryan's face flushed red. It was passed down to me from the department, he admitted reluctantly. A superior suggested she'd be a valuable witness. Lucas's jaw tightened slightly, though he kept his composure. A superior. I see. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, I respectfully request that we examine the process by which this witness was introduced. Something about this chain of command feels manipulated. Judge Whitaker raised an eyebrow. Manipulated? Yes, Your Honor, Lucas said. There's more to this than a simple arrest. He gestured to the courtroom. Consider the timing my involvement in a federal investigation exposing financial corruption and my sudden arrest for petty theft days later. Claire Morton, a former investigator who resigned under unclear circumstances, is brought in to give a vague testimony that only casts more shadows. A low wave of whispers broke through the gallery. The judge's gavel struck sharply. Order in the court! Lucas stepped closer to the bench, his voice low but urgent. Your Honor, I don't believe Officer Garrett acted alone. He may have believed he was doing his duty, but someone above him is pulling the strings. Ryan took a step forward, shaking his head. That's ridiculous. I wasn't following some conspiracy, I was following protocol. Lucas regarded him with a mixture of pity and frustration. Then tell me this, did you confirm the suspect description yourself, or were you told it was enough? Ryan froze. The truth hit him like a punch. He hadn't dug deeper. He'd trusted the information handed to him, trusted the system. Lucas turned back to the judge. This isn't just about Officer Garrett's judgment. It's about what happens when procedures are corrupted from the top down. And I believe we've only scratched the surface. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, signaling for calm. His expression was thoughtful, his brows furrowed. This is a serious claim, Mr. Sinclair. If you're implying that there's corruption within the police department, you'd better have more than suspicions. Lucas inclined his head. I understand, Your Honor. That's why I request a subpoena for Officer Garrett's internal case notes, emails, and communications related to this arrest. Ryan's head snapped up. What? Lucas's voice was steady. If there's nothing to hide, then this should clear everything up, right? The judge adjusted his glasses. That's an unusual but reasonable request under the circumstances. Officer Garrett, you will provide the requested materials to the court by the next session. Ryan's fists clenched at his sides, but he nodded stiffly. Yes, Your Honor. The courtroom adjourned briefly as the judge called for another recess. Ryan stormed out of the courtroom, Scott trailing behind him. This is out of control, Ryan muttered, his frustration boiling over. He's twisting everything. Scott caught up and grabbed his shoulder. Ryan, listen to me. What if he's right? What if someone set you up to take the fall? Ryan pulled away, glaring at his partner. No one set me up. I'm the one who made the arrest. Scott's voice softened. Exactly. You made the arrest, but who set the scene? Who handed you that vague description and told you it was enough? Ryan faltered, memories flashing through his mind, the hurried briefing, the lack of specifics, the pressure to make a high-profile arrest. Think, Ryan, Scott continued. Why Claire Morton? Why now? Ryan's shoulders sagged as reality began to sink in. If I was played, then why? Why use me? Scott's face darkened. Because you were an easy pawn, and Sinclair isn't their target. He's their threat. Ryan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. If Scott was right, everything was worse than he imagined. Meanwhile, Lucas stood in the quiet corner of the hallway, his phone pressed to his ear. Yes, it's happening exactly how I thought it would, he said quietly. A pause. Then Lucas's face hardened. No, I don't trust the witness. Whoever sent her wanted her to throw me off, but she's scared. Another pause. Lucas's voice lowered further. Tell the team to be ready. Once we get the subpoenaed documents, we'll know who's behind this. He ended the call and slipped his phone into his pocket, his gaze distant but resolute. The pieces were moving into place, but the game wasn't over yet. This was bigger than a wrongful arrest. It was a war over power, truth, and control, and Lucas Sinclair had no intention of losing. The second recess ended as the courtroom doors opened again. People filled the seats, whispering in hushed tones about what they'd just seen. Speculation buzzed like static in the air. Was Lucas Sinclair really a victim of a setup? Or was he just a master manipulator? Lucas took his seat, his posture as straight as ever. Officer Ryan Garrett entered from the side door, his face pale but set with determination. His partner, Scott Mayer, stayed a few steps behind, watching everything with growing unease. Judge Whitaker rapped his gavel. Court is now back in session. His sharp gaze scanned both Lucas and Ryan. Before we continue, I want to make something clear. We are here to seek the truth and nothing less. Mr. Sinclair, you may proceed. Lucas rose slowly, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, I appreciate the court's patience. I'm aware that my claims are serious. So, I'd like to present something tangible, a file that might shed light on how Officer Garrett came to arrest me. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a slim, leather-bound folder. The sight of it sent a ripple of anticipation through the courtroom. Ryan's jaw tightened. Lucas moved to the evidence table and held up the file. Your Honor, this is a collection of complaints and internal reports involving Officer Garrett. Some have been dismissed. Some were quietly closed without explanation. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Ryan stepped forward, his face flushed. Objection! This is irrelevant to the current case. The judge held up a hand, silencing him. Overruled? Mr. Sinclair, proceed. Lucas opened the file and read aloud. In 2019, a civilian reported being detained without cause by Officer Garrett. The case was closed with no disciplinary action. In 2020, another complaint, similar circumstances, similar closure. Lucas looked up, his gaze locking with Ryan's. And now, in 2025, I stand here because history is repeating itself. Ryan took a deep breath. Those reports don't prove misconduct. They prove that policing requires tough calls. Lucas tilted his head. Tough calls or unchecked bias? He addressed the judge again. Your Honor, I'm not saying Officer Garrett acted out of malice. I'm saying he acted on instinct, a flawed instinct shaped by patterns that have gone unchallenged for too long. The judge leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly on the bench. "Mr. Sinclair, are you suggesting that this arrest was motivated by bias rather than evidence?" Lucas's voice was calm but unyielding. "Yes, Your Honor. But there's more. I believe Officer Garrett wasn't the only one operating under these flawed assumptions. Someone higher up is pulling strings, manipulating cases, feeding selective information, and orchestrating arrests to protect their own interests." The courtroom buzzed again. Judge Whitaker tapped his gavel. "Order!" Lucas continued, unwavering. "I requested a subpoena for Officer Garrett's case notes, emails, and communications. And while we wait for those documents, I'd like to draw attention to one key question. Who benefits from my arrest?" Ryan took a step forward. "You're reaching, Sinclair. This is courtroom theater, not evidence." Lucas turned to face him fully, his expression sharp. "You're right, let's focus on evidence." He opened the file again and held up another page. "This is an email dated 3 days before my arrest. It's from an anonymous source, warning me that I was being watched. The message reads, 'They'll use any means necessary to shut you down. Watch your back.'" Ryan's face drained of color. The crowd's murmurs surged again, and even Judge Whitaker's normally stoic expression flickered with surprise. Scott Mayer, seated behind Ryan, leaned in and whispered, "Ryan, who's they?" Ryan didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind raced. He thought back to the day of the arrest, the way the briefing had been rushed, the vague descriptions, and the pressure from his superior to act quickly. Lucas set the email on the evidence table and addressed the room. "I'm not the only one in danger here. Officer Garrett may believe he was just doing his job, but I think he's being used. This case isn't about one man, it's about a system that rewards shortcuts over justice." The judge leaned back in his chair, his gaze heavy. "Officer Garrett, do you have any response?" Ryan swallowed hard, his hands curling into fists. "Your Honor, I thought I was following orders. I didn't mean for this to spiral like this." His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed forward. "But I need to know, why was I given so little to work with? Why was Claire Morton suggested to me as a witness?" Lucas nodded, his expression softening just slightly. "That's what I'm trying to uncover." He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I don't seek vengeance. I seek accountability. And if Officer Garrett was misled by someone in his department, then he deserves to know the truth too." The courtroom fell silent again. For the first time, Ryan wasn't standing in opposition to Lucas. He was standing on the same side of the line, searching for answers. Judge Whitaker exhaled slowly, his gavel resting on the desk. "I'll issue an expedited request for the subpoenaed documents. We'll reconvene once the court has reviewed them. Until then, this court is adjourned." The gavel struck, and the room erupted in conversation. Reporters scrambled to their feet, rushing toward the exits to file their stories. Lucas gathered his papers calmly as Ryan remained at the front of the room, staring into space. Scott approached, his voice low. "Ryan, what if Sinclair's right? What if someone's using you to bury him?" Ryan shook his head slowly. "I don't know, Scott, but if they are, I need to know why." As Lucas stepped outside the courthouse, the sunlight hit his face, but the warmth barely registered. A small crowd of onlookers and journalists gathered on the steps, microphones raised. "Mr. Sinclair, do you believe the police department is corrupt? Is this arrest part of something bigger?" Lucas paused at the top of the steps, his briefcase in hand. He looked directly at the cameras, his voice steady but resolute. "This isn't about one officer or one case. This is about what happens when systems designed to protect justice become tools of convenience and power. Accountability isn't just about finding one guilty party, it's about making sure this never happens again." With that, he turned and descended the steps, the crowd parting around him. In the distance, across the street, A man in a gray suit watched the scene unfold through dark sunglasses. He tapped a message into his phone. "We have a problem. He's not backing down." The fight was far from over, and Lucas knew it. Every step forward felt like stepping deeper into a maze where danger lurked in the shadows. But Lucas Sinclair wasn't just walking toward the truth. He was ready to tear down the walls, hiding it. The courtroom reconvened 2 days later, charged with tension, as if the walls themselves were bracing for impact. Every seat was filled. Reporters with sharp eyes and ready pens whispered to each other, sensing that what would happen today could reshape careers and maybe even lives. Lucas Sinclair arrived precisely on time, dressed in another sharp, dark suit. His briefcase clicked softly as he set it on the defense table. Across the room, Officer Ryan Garrett entered with a heavier gait than before. His usual confidence was dulled, replaced by something else, resolve mixed with uncertainty. His partner, Scott Mayer, gave him a small nod of encouragement from the gallery. Judge Whitaker entered, and the room fell silent as his gavel struck. "Court is now in session." The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at his notes. "We have received the subpoenaed documents from the police department. Mr. Sinclair, I understand you have reviewed the evidence?" Lucas stood. "Yes, Your Honor, and the contents speak louder than I ever could." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Lucas moved to the evidence screen and signaled the technician. "Your Honor, members of the court, I'd like to draw your attention to a specific file included in the subpoena, a surveillance video taken outside my office building on the day in question." The room hushed. Even Ryan sat up straighter, his face tense. He hadn't seen this footage yet. Lucas turned to the technician. "Play the file, please." The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy but clear view of a street corner. Pedestrians passed by, most of them paying no attention to the camera. And then, at the 10-second mark, a figure appeared, tall, wearing a dark suit and carrying a briefcase. The room collectively held its breath. The man on the screen turned slightly, his features sharpened into focus. Lucas paused the video. "Notice anything, Officer Garrett?" Ryan leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. Then he froze. The man on the screen wore a DOJ pin just like Lucas, but he had lighter skin, a broader nose, and a slightly different build. Lucas's voice was calm but cutting. "That's not me." A ripple of gasps spread through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward, frowning. Lucas resumed the footage. The man hurried past the camera, his face momentarily visible again before he disappeared from view. Whoever this man is, he was wearing what looked like federal credentials to impersonate someone like me. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity, it was a setup. Ryan's face turned pale. He could feel the blood drain from his cheeks. Lucas turned toward him, his eyes hard. "Officer Garrett, you arrested me based on a description that matched this man. Did you know there was surveillance footage near the scene?" Ryan shook his head, struggling to find his voice. No, I didn't." Lucas nodded, as if expecting that answer. "And did anyone in your chain of command mention this footage existed?" Ryan's silence was deafening. The judge's voice was sharp. "Officer Garrett, answer the question." Ryan exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping. "No, Your Honor." Lucas pressed forward. "In fact, Officer Garrett, you weren't given any new evidence after that initial vague description, were you?" Ryan's throat felt dry. He shook his head again. "No." Lucas took a step back, addressing the courtroom. "That's the danger of trusting incomplete information and failing to ask the hard questions. Someone wanted me silenced, and they knew that all it would take was a suit, a pin, and someone eager to make an arrest." Ryan shot to his feet, fists clenched. "I wasn't eager to make an arrest. I was doing my job." Lucas's voice softened. "Were you? Or were you doing someone else's job for them?" The question hung in the air like a blade, ready to fall. The judge tapped his gavel twice. "Order." He turned to Ryan. "Officer Garrett, who instructed you to proceed with such limited evidence?" Ryan hesitated. His mind raced through the chain of events, the briefing, the pressure from his commanding officer, the email with the witness's name. Everything was pointing in one direction, but the truth was a weight he wasn't sure he could bear. Finally, he spoke. "Captain Hendricks." Lucas's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes darkened. "And did Captain Hendricks tell you why this case was urgent?" Ryan's voice was barely above a whisper. "No." Lucas turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, Captain Hendricks has a history of questionable tactics, particularly when it comes to high-profile cases. I believe he orchestrated this arrest to sabotage my investigation into financial fraud involving federal contracts." The gallery erupted into murmurs. Scott Mayer closed his eyes briefly, muttering, "Damn it." The judge's gavel struck hard. "Order in the court." He turned to Lucas. "Mr. Sinclair, you're implying a conspiracy at the highest levels of law enforcement." Lucas met the judge's gaze evenly. "Yes, Your Honor, and the man on the screen is proof that someone wanted me out of the way, someone who knew impersonating a federal prosecutor would create just enough chaos to derail me." The judge sat back, steeling his fingers. "This is unprecedented." He paused, the silence heavy. "But I can't deny that the evidence raises serious questions. I'll authorize a deeper investigation into Captain Hendricks and his involvement. In the meantime, Officer Garrett, you're placed on administrative leave until we can determine your role in this situation." Ryan's face fell, but he nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Lucas inhaled slowly, letting the weight of the moment sink in. He had won a small battle, but the war was far from over. After the judge adjourned the session, Ryan approached Lucas near the defense table. His voice was low, almost resigned. "I don't know who set this up, but I swear I didn't know." Lucas studied him for a moment before giving a slight nod. "I believe you, but believing you doesn't fix this. Finding the truth does." Ryan hesitated. "If you think Hendricks is behind this, what happens if you're right?" Lucas's eyes hardened. "Then people like him will finally face justice." Ryan glanced toward the gallery, where Claire Morton sat, her head low. "And if we're both just pawns in something bigger?" Lucas picked up his briefcase and adjusted his jacket. "Then we stop being pawns and start being players." Ryan gave a slow nod. "Then I hope you find what you're looking for, Sinclair." Lucas's gaze never wavered. "I will, but this time, I won't be looking alone." As Lucas walked out of the courthouse, the sun was sinking behind the city's skyline. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from an unknown number. "They're watching." Lucas stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and continued down the steps, his resolve solid as stone. He had pulled back the curtain, but the shadows behind it were deeper than he'd ever imagined. And somewhere in those shadows, the real enemy was waiting. Lucas Sinclair stepped into the brisk evening air outside the courthouse, but instead of relief, a chill ran down his spine. The text message still lingered in his mind. "They're watching." It was both a warning and a confirmation that his fight was far from over. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and glanced across the street. That's when he saw him, the man in the gray suit. He stood near a lamppost, arms folded, sunglasses hiding his eyes despite the setting sun. Lucas felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He didn't need to see the man's face to know one thing. He was being followed. Lucas didn't slow his pace, but his mind began racing. He kept walking until he reached the corner and ducked into a nearby coffee shop. He stepped to the side of the door, peering back out just in time to see the man follow. Slow, but deliberate. Lucas grabbed his phone and dialed. "Scott, it's Sinclair. I need you to meet me now." 15 minutes later, Scott Mayer slid into the booth across from Lucas. The shop's noise was a comforting cover, a symphony of grinding beans, conversations, and clinking mugs. Scott looked around before whispering, "All right, Lucas, what's going on?" Lucas leaned forward, his voice low. "Someone's following me, and they aren't subtle about it." Scott frowned. "You sure?" Lucas nodded. 100%. I recognized his type the second I saw him. Clean suit, blank face, predator-like patience. He's not just a bystander. Scott rubbed his chin, thinking. If they're watching you, that means you're getting too close to something. And if they're that bold, they aren't scared of being caught. Lucas's eyes darkened. They should be. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a new set of documents, emails, timestamps, and records he had pieced together after the subpoenaed files came through. Scott's eyes widened as he scanned the papers. Wait, these aren't just internal police memos. This looks like financial transactions, Lucas finished. Wire transfers, off-the-books payments, all traced back to private contractors with ties to law enforcement. He pointed to a specific entry. This payment was made 2 days before my arrest. Guess who authorized it? Scott's jaw tensed as he read the name. Captain Hendricks. Lucas nodded grimly. Hendricks didn't just orchestrate my arrest, he's laundering money through fake investigations. He's been using cops like Garrett as pawns to cover up bigger crimes. Scott let out a low whistle. No wonder someone wants you silenced. He looked up at Lucas. But you can't take this to the press yet, not without a stronger case. If you do, they'll spin it as paranoia. Lucas's face hardened. I know, but we don't have time for slow investigations. Whoever that man outside is, he's a warning that things are escalating. Scott nodded slowly. So, what's the plan? Lucas leaned closer, his voice measured but resolute. We need to get to Hendricks before he knows we're coming. I've already tracked his private meetings to a secure building downtown. If we catch him in the act, it'll be enough to break this wide open. Scott's eyes narrowed. That's dangerous, Lucas. Lucas's gaze didn't waver. So is doing nothing. Scott sat back for a moment, exhaling slowly. All right, I'm in. But if we're doing this, we need backup. Lucas nodded. I've already made a call. An old DOJ contact. I trust they'll meet us downtown. Scott gave a slow smile. You're always 2 steps ahead, huh? Lucas's lips twitched, but it wasn't quite a smile. Let's hope it's enough. As the sky darkened, Lucas and Scott exited the coffee shop through the back alley. The streets around them buzzed with traffic, the city alive but indifferent to the storm brewing beneath its surface. Stay close, Lucas muttered, as they crossed to a quieter street near a high-rise with tinted windows. This is the place? Scott asked, eyeing the building warily. Lucas nodded. Hendricks has a private office on the 12th floor. If he's here tonight, we'll know. Scott raised an eyebrow. And if he's not? Lucas's expression hardened. Then we're 1 step behind. They reached the side entrance, where a third figure was waiting, a woman in her late 40s, wearing a black blazer and holding a secure briefcase. Her sharp gaze met Lucas's. Marissa Hall, Lucas introduced, one of the best forensic analysts the DOJ ever had. Scott extended a hand. Good to have you. Marissa shook it briefly. I'm here because Lucas said this is worth it. It is. She pulled out a flash drive. This contains a data-cracking tool for encrypted files. If Hendricks is as dirty as you say, he'll have backups in his system. Lucas nodded. Let's move. The building was eerily quiet as they slipped inside, bypassing the main lobby through a service corridor Lucas had mapped earlier. They reached the elevator, its polished steel reflecting their serious faces. Scott glanced at Lucas. You sure about this? Lucas hit the 12th floor button. No, but that's never stopped me before. The elevator dinged as they arrived. The hallway was empty, but a faint hum of voices came from the end of the corridor. They moved silently, stopping just outside Hendricks' office. Lucas pressed his ear to the door. He's in there. Scott's heart pounded. What now? Lucas exchanged a glance with Marissa, who handed him a small device. Now, we catch him red-handed. With a nod, Lucas opened the door. Captain Hendricks looked up, startled. He was seated behind a sleek desk, his laptop open, files scattered across the surface. Beside him stood the man in the gray suit, the same man who had followed Lucas earlier. The room crackled with tension as Hendricks's eyes narrowed. Sinclair, you're either brave or stupid. Lucas took a step inside, calm despite the storm raging in his veins. You'll find I'm both. Hendricks leaned back, unbothered. You have no jurisdiction here. Lucas held up his DOJ badge. Try me. The man in the gray suit reached toward his waistband, but Scott stepped forward, raising a hand. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Marissa moved quickly, plugging the flash drive into Hendricks's laptop while he glared. The screen flickered as encrypted files began decrypting one by one. Hendricks's calm facade cracked. You have no idea what you're messing with. Lucas's voice was cold steel. Oh, I know exactly what I'm messing with. The real question is, how long did you think you could hide it? The laptop beeped, displaying a folder labeled Confidential Transfers. Marissa's fingers flew across the keyboard. This is it. We've got him. Hendricks lunged forward, but Scott intercepted him, forcing him back into the chair. Lucas stared down at the man who had tried to destroy him. Game over, Hendricks. For the first time, Hendricks's eyes filled with something Lucas recognized. Fear. The truth wasn't just out, it was undeniable. And as the sirens wailed outside, signaling backup, Lucas knew this web of corruption was finally unraveling. But one question remained. How far would the people in the shadows go to stop the truth from spreading? The blare of sirens filled the night air outside the building, their echoes bouncing off glass and steel. Red and blue lights flashed across the lobby as law enforcement swarmed the area. But on the 12th floor, the war of silence and shadows was reaching its climax. Captain Hendricks sat rigid in his chair, his eyes darting between the open laptop and the officers in the room. His usually cool composure was gone, replaced by the unmistakable sheen of fear. The man in the gray suit stood by the window, his fingers twitching near his waist. Lucas Sinclair noticed but kept his voice calm. Whatever you're reaching for won't save you, Lucas said, stepping forward. Not tonight. Scott Mayer hovered near Hendricks, watching his every move. Let's keep this simple. You've been caught red-handed. Do yourself a favor and cooperate. Hendricks gave a slow, bitter laugh. You think you've won? His voice was quiet but venomous. You're not fighting one man. You're fighting the system itself. Lucas raised an eyebrow. The system? No, Hendricks. We're fighting the people who've corrupted it, people like you. Marissa Hall's eyes flicked to the laptop as the decryption process completed. It's all here, she muttered. Her fingers flew across the keys, opening folders filled with incriminating files. Payment logs, encrypted emails, and memos detailing how Hendricks had funneled money through fake investigations and private contractors. She turned the screen toward Lucas. Multiple accounts tied to overseas shell companies. These payments coincide with every major arrest Hendricks orchestrated, each one conveniently timed to cover up something bigger. Scott stared at the screen, stunned. He's been running this operation for years. Hendricks's lip curled into a snarl. You don't understand how this works. You think exposing me will stop it. I'm a cog in a machine that's been running for decades. Cut me down and someone else takes my place. Lucas stepped closer, his voice low but firm. Then we'll cut down the whole machine, piece by piece. The man in the gray suit finally spoke, his voice cold and measured. You won't live long enough to see that happen. Before anyone could react, he reached into his jacket. Scott lunged forward, slamming the man into the wall before he could draw his weapon. The two struggled, the man twisting like a snake to break free, but Scott held firm. "Lucas, get Hendricks out of here," Scott shouted. Lucas grabbed Hendricks by the collar, yanking him out of his chair. "Move!" Marissa grabbed her briefcase, slamming the laptop shut. "I've got the data." The hallway erupted in noise as Lucas, Scott, and Marissa dragged their suspects toward the elevator. The man in the gray suit had been subdued, groaning as officers arriving from downstairs snapped handcuffs onto his wrists. The elevator ride down was tense. Hendricks' breathing was ragged, but Lucas didn't loosen his grip. "You'll answer for all of it," Lucas muttered. Hendricks glared up at him, his eyes burning with defiance. "You're making a mistake, Sinclair. Do you have any idea what forces you've just unleashed?" Lucas leaned in, his gaze unyielding. "Yes, and I'm not afraid of them." The elevator doors slid open, revealing a chaotic scene in the lobby. Reporters were already gathering outside, cameras flashing as officers led the man in the gray suit toward a patrol car. The moment they saw Lucas dragging Hendricks, the shouting began. "Lucas Sinclair, what charges are being brought against Captain Hendricks? Is this part of your investigation into DOJ corruption? Did Hendricks order your arrest?" Lucas didn't slow as he shoved Hendricks through the crowd, the press surging forward like a tide. One reporter shoved a microphone inches from Lucas's face. "Mr. Sinclair, are you afraid of retaliation from within the department?" Lucas stopped and looked directly into the camera, his voice unwavering. "I'm not afraid of the truth. The real question is, how long has everyone else been willing to look the other way?" The crowd went silent for a moment, as if the weight of his words had stolen their breath. Inside a nearby squad car, Hendricks stared out the window, his expression twisted with anger and something else, desperation. As he was cuffed and read his rights, he glanced back toward the building. He wasn't just worried about the fallout, he was terrified of whoever was watching from the shadows. Lucas, Marissa, and Scott gathered by the police barricade, watching as Hendricks was driven away. Scott exhaled slowly. "Well, that's one down. But you heard him, Lucas. There's more." Lucas nodded, his gaze distant. "I know. Hendricks was just the beginning." Marissa folded her arms. "The files we have are enough to open up multiple federal investigations. But this kind of corruption doesn't end with arrests. It gets messier." Lucas's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. "You've made your move. Now it's our turn." He clenched his jaw and pocketed the phone. "We're running out of time." Scott frowned. "What do you mean?" Lucas turned to face them. "Whoever's behind this isn't just going to wait for the system to take them down. They'll come for us first." Marissa's face hardened. "Then we stay ahead of them. We've got the evidence, we use it to bring everything into the light." Lucas's expression was resolute. "No more shadows, no more secrets." He took one last look at the flashing lights and chaos before turning toward the city skyline. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, they weren't just reacting. They were ready to fight back. In the distance, another unmarked car pulled away from the scene, its driver blending into traffic as if he'd never been there. But Lucas knew better. The game had shifted, and now they were up against forces that played by different rules. As he walked toward his car, Lucas whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "Let them come. I'm ready." The hum of the city filled the night as Lucas Sinclair leaned against his car, watching the unmarked vehicle disappear into traffic. The streets blurred behind a haze of headlights, but Lucas's focus sharpened. The text still echoed in his mind. "You've made your move. Now it's our turn." Scott Mayer walked up beside him, his face etched with concern. "We should regroup," he said. "Whoever sent that message, they're making their next play, and fast." Lucas nodded but didn't move right away. "They've been 2 steps ahead this whole time. Not anymore." He exhaled slowly, the weight of the night pressing on his shoulders. This ends soon, one way or another. 2 hours later, Lucas, Scott, and Marissa Hall sat around a long conference table, in a secure DOJ field office. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan. The files Marissa had decrypted sat in organized stacks. A whiteboard on the wall displayed a web of names connected by red lines. Marissa tapped the screen of her laptop. "This folder is the key," she said, highlighting an encrypted document labeled Directive Omega. "If this is what I think it is, it's the smoking gun, a document detailing every false investigation Hendricks initiated and the orders he received." Scott crossed his arms. "But it's still encrypted. Can we break it?" Marissa's fingers danced across the keyboard. "Not with the standard DOJ tools, it's military-grade encryption." She looked at Lucas. "There's only one way. We need access to the agency's secure servers." Lucas frowned. "Which means walking straight into the belly of the beast." Scott's eyes widened. "You can't be serious. You're talking about the main DOJ hub. After tonight's arrest, they'll be watching you like a hawk." Lucas stood and adjusted his suit jacket. "Then we give them something else to watch." Marissa looked up, curious. "What do you mean?" Lucas paced the room, his mind working quickly. "We split up. Marissa, you and I go into the DOJ building. Scott, you leak the basics of the Hendricks scandal to a trusted reporter. Once the story hits, they'll scramble to contain the narrative. While they're distracted, we pull what we need from the servers." Scott's mouth twitched into a half-smile. "You want to set the building on fire while you walk straight in?" Lucas's expression was grim but determined. Figuratively speaking, Marissa closed her laptop and stood. "It's bold, but it might be our only shot." Scott exhaled, nodding reluctantly. "All right, let's do this." The DOJ headquarters loomed tall against the night sky, its mirrored windows reflecting the streetlights below. Lucas and Marissa approached the side entrance, their badges ready. Marissa's pulse raced as they passed through security. She glanced at Lucas, who walked with steady confidence. "You're too calm," she whispered. Lucas gave her a faint smirk. "I've spent years walking into places where people wanted me gone. It's a learned skill." They reached the secure wing where the servers were housed. Lucas swiped his ID card, and the door unlocked with a soft beep. Inside, rows of servers hummed quietly, their green and blue lights blinking like constellations in the dim room. Marissa immediately got to work, connecting her device to one of the ports. "Give me 2 minutes," she muttered, typing furiously. Lucas kept an eye on the door, his senses on high alert. The plan was risky, but it was the only way to shine a light on the web of corruption they'd uncovered. Suddenly, the door at the far end of the hall opened. 2 security officers stepped in, their expressions sharp. Lucas's heart quickened. "We've got company." Marissa didn't look up. 30 more seconds. The officers approached. "What are you doing here?" one of them demanded. Lucas stepped forward, blocking their view of Marissa. He pulled out his badge. "Special DOJ case. Clearance level 7. The officer narrowed his eyes. "We weren't informed of any late-night investigations." Lucas smiled faintly. "That's because this investigation is about people who thought they'd never be investigated." The officer hesitated, glancing at his partner. Lucas's calm tone gave them pause, but he knew it wouldn't last. Behind him, Marissa whispered, "Got it." She pulled the flash drive out and slipped it into her pocket. Lucas nodded toward her. "We're done here. Let's move." The officers exchanged glances, but before they could react, Lucas and Marissa brushed past them, exiting the room. Lucas kept his pace steady until they reached the elevator. Once the doors closed, Marissa let out a shaky breath. That was too close. Lucas looked at the flash drive in her hand. "But we've got it. The truth is finally ours." Meanwhile, across town, Scott Mayer sat in a quiet diner, his laptop open. The glow of the screen lit his face as he typed the final email. He attached the decrypted files and sent them to an investigative journalist he trusted, someone known for blowing the whistle on powerful corruption. He checked his phone. 5 minutes later, the journalist's response popped up. "We're running the story first thing in the morning. I'll make sure the world knows." Scott leaned back and exhaled. It's out there now. By the time Lucas and Marissa exited the DOJ building, the city's early morning quiet had begun to settle. The chaos of the previous night felt distant, but as they reached Lucas's car, his phone buzzed again. Unknown number. "You don't know what you've done." Marissa read the message over his shoulder. "They're scared." Lucas nodded. "Good. They should be." As they drove away, the first breaking news alert flashed on Scott's phone across the city. DOJ scandal unfolds. High-ranking officials linked to corruption ring. The reckoning had begun, but Lucas knew it wouldn't end without more resistance. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his voice quiet but resolute. This time they won't get away. The morning sky was painted in shades of gold and crimson as the first rays of sunlight lit the city. But the serene dawn was at odds with the storm brewing inside the Department of Justice. Lucas Sinclair watched the news unfold on a screen in the conference room of the secure DOJ field office. The bold headlines scrolled across the bottom. DOJ corruption exposed. Federal prosecutor uncovers conspiracy. A reporter's voice narrated the details as photos of Captain Hendricks and damning documents flashed on the screen. Lucas's name was mentioned multiple times, both as a target and a hero. The world was finally seeing the truth, and for a fleeting moment, he let himself breathe. Scott Mayer walked in, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You did it," he said, handing one to Lucas. "It's everywhere. They can't cover this up anymore." Marissa Hall followed close behind, a satisfied but wary expression on her face. "We've thrown the first punch. Now let's see who punches back." Lucas took a sip of the bitter coffee, his gaze fixed on the screen. "We've forced their hand. They'll retaliate fast and hard." Scott sat across from him. "You think Hendricks will crack?" Lucas nodded slowly. "He doesn't have a choice. Once the indictment hits, he'll either cooperate or go down alone." Marissa folded her arms. "And the man in the gray suit?" Lucas's eyes darkened. "That's who we need to worry about. He's not just muscle. He's connected to something bigger." Scott frowned. "Someone like him doesn't just appear out of nowhere. He's the kind of guy sent when things get dangerous." Marissa tapped on her laptop, pulling up files they had decrypted. "I've been running his facial recognition profile. He's linked to a private intelligence contractor, Redmount Solutions, a group known for off-the-record operations and plausible deniability. If they're involved, we're dealing with more than just dirty cops." Scott ran a hand through his hair. "You're telling me this whole thing isn't just internal corruption? It's outsourced?" Lucas leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "It means the people who hired Hendricks were playing an even bigger game than we thought." The federal courthouse was packed for the emergency hearing. Lucas sat at the prosecution's table, files neatly stacked in front of him. Across the aisle, Captain Hendricks was led into the room in handcuffs. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, but his defiance hadn't completely disappeared. The judge entered, his robe billowing as he took his seat. "This hearing will address the charges brought against Captain Hendricks and the revelations surrounding recent DOJ operations." He turned his gaze to Hendricks. "Captain, how do you plead?" Hendricks's lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously, but Hendricks barely seemed to hear him. His gaze was locked on Lucas, filled with equal parts hatred and fear. Lucas stood, addressing the court. "Your Honor, we have provided this court with irrefutable evidence of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. These documents show that Captain Hendricks authorized unlawful detentions, manipulated investigations, and used department resources to cover up millions of dollars in embezzled federal funds." The judge nodded. "The court has reviewed the evidence. Does the defense wish to respond?" Hendricks's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, my client was acting under orders. He was not the mastermind behind these actions. He was a scapegoat." The gallery erupted in whispers. The judge struck his gavel. "Order!" Lucas's eyes sharpened. Is that true, Captain? Were you following orders? If so, whose? The courtroom went silent as Hendricks shifted in his seat. His lawyer's hand clutched his arm, but Hendricks shrugged it off. You want the truth? Hendricks' voice cracked, but it carried enough venom to fill the room. I did what I had to do to survive. The people giving the orders? They're untouchable, and they don't lose. Lucas stepped closer to the bench. Then name them. Hendricks's shoulders sagged, and for a moment everyone thought he might finally break. But then he let out a bitter laugh. If I name them, I'm a dead man. And so are you. Lucas didn't flinch. Maybe, but I'd rather die fighting for the truth than live under their thumb. The judge watched the exchange carefully. Captain Hendricks, I suggest you think carefully about your next words. The tension in the room was unbearable. The weight of the moment pressed on everyone as Hendricks looked from the judge to Lucas. Finally, he muttered, You'll find their names in the directive files, but you won't like what you see. The courtroom was adjourned, but the chaos outside had only grown. Reporters swarmed the entrance, demanding updates as federal agents led Hendricks away. Lucas, Scott, and Marissa regrouped at the side exit, avoiding the crush of journalists. Marissa's fingers trembled slightly as she held the flash drive containing the decrypted Directive Omega file. If what he said is true, we're about to open Pandora's box. Scott's phone buzzed. He glanced down and cursed. Lucas, you need to see this. He handed Lucas his phone. The screen displayed a breaking news alert. DOJ whistleblower targeted. Unmarked vehicle found in flames outside federal prosecutor's office. Lucas's heart sank. He read the words twice, bile rising in his throat. Someone had just sent a message loud and clear. Scott's voice was low. They're not waiting. They've already started coming after us. Marissa clenched her fists. Then we hit back harder. Lucas met her gaze, fire burning behind his calm expression. We finish this. Lucas stared at his reflection in the window of his office. The city lights blinked in the distance, but they felt miles away. The weight of everything rested on his shoulders. The stakes, the risks, the cost. Scott sat on the couch, rubbing his tired eyes. You sure we're ready for what's coming? Lucas nodded slowly. We've come too far to stop now. The truth is out. And the world's watching. Marissa entered, holding a folder. Then let's give them something worth watching. Lucas turned from the window, his face set with quiet determination. Justice isn't just about winning cases. It's about making sure the right people are held accountable, no matter what it costs. He picked up the phone and dialed a familiar number. When the person on the other end picked up, Lucas spoke calmly, but firmly. I'm ready to go public. Schedule the press conference. Marissa and Scott exchanged a look, but said nothing. Lucas set the phone down and looked at them. This ends tomorrow. The room was silent as the weight of his words settled. Tomorrow would be the reckoning not just for Hendricks, but for everyone who had thrived in the shadows for too long. Lucas's voice carried a quiet strength as he repeated the words that had fueled him from the start. No more shadows, no more secrets. And as dawn broke over the city once more, the world braced for a truth it could no longer ignore. The fight for justice is never easy, but it starts with the courage to speak out, to expose the truth, and to demand accountability. Lucas Sinclair's journey proves that change isn't about one case or one courtroom. It's about all of us refusing to stay silent in the face of corruption and injustice. If this story resonated with you, don't let it stop here. Share it. Talk about it. Let it inspire action in your community. And if you believe in the power of stories to spark conversations and create change, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to join us in this journey. Together, we can shine a light in the darkest places and remind the world that justice isn't given, it's fought for. Thank you for watching. Stay vigilant, stay strong, and remember, The truth always matters.